You are listening to Talking Star Wars. Hello, Star Wars fans. I'm Connor.
And I'm Alex.
And today we're going to talk about Star Wars and a bit of a sequel episode to our episode 69 on Force Ghosts. We're doing the flip side of that and kind of taking a look at more of the dark side of this thought for Force Ghosts. So, Alex, why don't you give us a little bit more detail into what we're going to be diving into?
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thank you for joining us for episode 70. Another investigation into force powers about Sith soul binding, or Sith soul manipulation. So this is a dark side power that is depicted in several areas of canon, where while certain Jedi learn the art to come back as force ghosts, we see that Sith, who are not in tune with the living force, but instead seek to dominate it, but are also somewhat terrified of death, will seek to prolong their lives by binding their souls and consciousness to objects, locations, and so on in an attempt to prolong their lives.
Mhm. Because Sith don't really get the chance at extended life. They have more of a facsimile of what it's like to have a long-lasting life.
So we see this Sith soul binding technique depicted in several areas. In the canon movies and films, it is primarily shown rather infamously in the form of Palpatine himself, who in the sequel trilogy manages to transfer his soul into a badly cloned body and then
Mhm.
is seeking to transfer that soul from the badly cloned body into his direct descendant, Rey, which would allow him to fully connect with the Force. And this is revealed to be part of Operation Necromancer, which the Imperial Remnant and later on the First Order carried on in an attempt to bring their Emperor back to life.
Mhm. And this was explored in Legends as well, just because uh, I guess the idea of cloning Palpatine has always been a popular one. But it's this idea that he is able to take possession of either his own body or someone else who's related to him in order to transfer his essence, mind, and power to the next appropriate vessel.
Nothing beats the dark side like a dark side clone. So
Hmm.
apparently it's all the hip rage. Though Palpatine was relatively groundbreaking in that he sought a clone of himself to bind his soul to. Prior to that, we primarily see Sith dealing with soul binding to objects.
I was just going to ask, so what sort of objects do we see commonly used by the Sith?
Well, because they're Sith, they lean towards the extravagant, the very extra, and the very, I would say, flashy.
Hmm.
So the three objects I'm aware of that the Sith bound their souls to are all masks. So,
Understandable.
yep. And because at least all these masks were, a couple of them contained the consciousnesses of Sith lords who wanted to extend their lives after death. And so imprinted their consciousness and memories into a mask. And there's another partial mask that we'll talk about where it contains the memories of many previous users and drives them to continually seek out the dark side and then usually ends up in their death.
Hmm.
So, looking at these masks that we're aware of, the first mask that we see in the current canon that has a Sith Lord's soul bound to it is the mask of Darth Momin. Momin was a Sith architect who eschewed the rule of two in that he refused to train an apprentice. And his only desire was to build extravagant architecture and art. An art that was, as a child, he produced art that was so grotesque and horrifying that he was nearly killed by his home planet. And then when he was recruited by his own Sith master, he eventually killed her to pursue his art and never bothered to train an apprentice. So
Oh,
he considers himself this artist who has transcended morality, and the only true art can be found in the dark side. So Palpatine comes into possession of Darth Momin's mask. Momin is, of course, murdered by the Jedi uh, after his greatest artwork, which was to freeze an entire city in the constant moment of their entire destruction, leaving them in continual agony for the rest of time and space.
Yikes.
Momin was not a great guy. He was still a Sith Lord of the highest degree, despite his claim to be artistic.
Mhm.
So Palpatine comes into possession of the mask of Darth Momin, and he eventually gifts this to Darth Vader, because Darth Vader wants to go and build his fortress on Mustafar, and he's
Mhm.
like, "All right, well, you need an architect for it." We're unknowing if Palpatine knew that the mask had the soul of Momin in it, but is present on the ship that he gives to Vader, and then the mask starts to possess people around Vader and is like, "I will be your architect." In fact, possesses the standard Imperial architect that is sent with him, and overwrites her own designs to give him something grander and more attuned to the dark side.
You mentioned this idea of destroying a whole entire city and allowing it to be frozen in the moment of its destruction. Sounds eerily like Malachor, and usually I leave the obscure reference like connections to you, but we see this dark side planet of Malachor ostensibly frozen in its moment of destruction. I was wondering if you think there might be any connection between the two, or the timeline lines up.
Oh no, I do not believe Darth Momin was involved in Malachor. It was a different planet.
Gotcha.
There was not a big fight against a whole group of Sith. Momin is still from the tradition of the Bainite Sith, where he was part of the lineage of the Rule of Two before he abandoned it, and then new Sith had to rise to fill his place.
Hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah, so this is he is in the period between the destruction of Malachor and the uh, rise of the Empire.
Hmm.
Yeah, so Momin's mask is relatively simple, and we see that the mask, by someone wearing it, Momin is almost immediately able to possess the mind of whoever is wearing the mask, in that he takes over their body, his own personality becomes dominant, and literally we see the mask being worn by Imperial stormtroopers. We see the mask being worn by natives to Mustafar. When Vader is angry one time, he even puts the mask on a local, like beetle-like creature because he's upset with Momin's continual overpromises about the architecture. Because what Momin promises Vader is that he can build a structure on this dark side nexus on Mustafar that will allow Vader to bring the soul of Padme Amidala back and resurrect her.
Hmm.
And Vader believes the Momin can do this because, as Palpatine has told him, the dark side is the way you can transcend death.
Hmm.
Palpatine plans to do it via cloning, but of course and soul transference, but of course he doesn't tell Vader that. So Vader pursues his own ends. Yeah, and just to focus more on Momin himself and the soul binding. So we see, as part of a side effect of the soul binding technique, is that Momin is the same as he was on the day he died. The same hubris that left him vulnerable to being killed by the Jedi, that left his ultimate plan unrealized, that led to his death, his same character flaws follow him into his half-life bound in this mask. He can no longer learn or change. He retains memories, but his personality has become static.
Hmm.
So unlike Force Ghosts, who we see able to learn new information, adapt, and change, we see some stasis set in on these bound Sith individuals. And in fact, Momin then attempts to turn on Darth Vader, and that does not go very well for the bound soul of Momin in his mask.
Hmm. That makes sense.
What questions do you have, or anything you wanted to dive into about Darth Momin, the Sith artist and avant-garde, horrifying architect that is bound to a mask, helps Vader build his
Mhm.
fortress in Mustafar, and then attempts to use the portal to himself take over a body and return to full life?
Sure. Well, I do have my questions. I do have my curiosities as to whether Moment is taking place in some old Republic. That was his heyday, or if it was High Republic, it would probably be more so Old Republic if he's not totally beholden to the rule of two, because I think that still exists in canon, in some degree. Um, but I think beyond that, it shows just how desperate the Sith are. I think that, if we take a look at the idea of immortality, the Jedi have not been concerned with that. The Jedi gained that as an ability in order to help others, in order to act as guides and teachers. Sith want it for very personal, selfish reasons. So we will ultimately see uh, them fail in some regard. So it makes sense for them to find very unusual, eclectic means of allowing themselves to last. And for someone so interested in art, it makes sense for it to be reflective in that idea of armor as well.
Yeah, it definitely shows the desperation of the Sith and their fascination with the physical trappings of power. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we don't see one like, I bound my soul to this grain of sand and no one will ever find it. Haha, I am now a dark side lich. It's like, no,
Mm-hmm.
it is this dramatic mask that people will put on and I will take over their personality. The Sith do not do anything really low key.
Right. It's all over the top dramatic.
Well, would you like us to move on to the next bound Sith soul in a mask that we see?
The next bound mask, yes.
Yeah, so this appears in the novel Shadow of the Sith. And this is the mask of Exim Panshard, who was a Sith Lord, or at least a dark side user. He doesn't have the word
Mm-hmm.
Darth in front of his name. This is potentially because either he rejected that title or predated the title of Darth.
Mm-hmm.
But he possesses in a non-force sensitive woman who is sort of an acolyte of the Emperor's cult, and Exim Panshard sort of takes over her body continually and is able to wield the Force, even though she herself is not Force sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And this is less like where Momin was able to completely overpower his hosts and to sort of temporarily take over their bodies wholesale. We see Exim Panshard doing the more seductive Sith thing, like slowly convincing his host to give him up more and more control, parceling out power to his host as they need it, until finally he wants to do the final push to take over their body completely. And
Mm-hmm.
Exim Panshard is old, very
Sure.
old, very powerful. Like when he confronts Luke Skywalker in the prime of his power and is a match for Luke Skywalker. They have a dramatic duel on an ice moon with sea serpents underneath. It's
Mm-hmm.
very powerful image. But in the end, again, Exim Panchard has not learned anything in the past,
Mm-hmm.
even though we get, he gets an ancient Sith lightsaber. He has this pawn. He, even after the mask is smashed, he's able to repair it and bring it back to life. But he still falls prey to the same hubris and the same lack of ability to exercise the right foresight, but is a
Mm-hmm.
remarkably powerful antagonist for Luke Skywalker to fight against.
Seems like it would be a very old Republic Sith. I'm taking some inspiration from the fact that Disney and their new canon likes to reference the name of certain characters. Like we have Starkiller Base in Legends, we have a Starkiller character. We have Galen Erso, who made the Death Star and created the plans to destroy it. We have Galen Merrick, who is Starkiller. It's just this kind of shared space. So the name Exim Panshard reminds me very much of Exar Kun, who's this just ancient legends uh, Jedi turned Sith from 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. So I see some just kind of a slight, not even a callback, but just a very subtle, not even a reference, but just kind of something that is very faintly reminiscent to something from Legends, to have someone who is so old in the past that they predate this idea of Darth. They're still Sith, but they are still evil. Um, Also makes sense that this character is stuck. This character has not lived in the galaxy and has not learned from the Force. If we look at Obi-Wan Kenobi, if we take a look at Anakin Skywalker, both of them have to come to terms with some of the mistakes they made, where Kenobi has to reconcile the fact that, well, I thought it was best to kill Vader, but I guess you could redeem him. And Anakin is having to reconcile the fact that he was Vader when trying to teach Ahsoka. So, again, the reason why we have Force ghosts are to act as teachers. Sith, specters are very far separated from that.
Yeah, and I do think that Panchard was certainly ancient. He he ended up wanting to supplant Palpatine's plans because he's like, I'm the real Sith here, and he wants to get to Exegol and take over the dark side powers there and become his own ruler. He acquires the lightsaber of Darth Noctis with his pawn Kiza, but is again eventually defeated by Jedi Master Luke Skywalker.
Mhm.
But we do get some information about the mask, and that apparently Viceroy Exim Panshard slaughtered 100 people to get the necessary energy to bind his soul to the mask. So it's where we sort of get the sort of Sith blood magic, or death power that we see them sometimes referring to.
Mhm. So, any other details on our second of three masks?
Oh, that's all we know about Exim Panshard. Again, he's just a fragment of an ancient Sith bound to this mask. Ends up being very difficult to defeat him, but once he's finally defeated, Luke destroys the mask and banishes the soul of Exim Panshard forever, as far as we're aware.
Yeah, could be on the other side of the galaxy as far as we know, but they're probably not going to mind that uh, in the Disney canon. But in any case, what are we looking at for our third Sith mask?
So this mask appears in one of my favorite little Star Wars books called Dark Legends, where it's all told like dark fairy tales.
Mhm.
And the story we specifically want to look at is all about um, a mask that is in the possession of Doc Ondar, who is a acquirer of curiosities based on the planet of Batu, and Slocken, a grasping bureaucrat and art collector, purchases the mask. And when you put on the mask, it shows you the dark deeds committed by previous owners of the mask to achieve their current position. And so by wearing the mask late at night, it encourages Slocan to do things like poison his superior to achieve his position, to blackmail another representative to increase his own wealth.
Mhm.
But then finally it shows him that his actions will drive everyone away from him and one of his underlings will murder him. So he, except for his one trusted advisor, sends everyone away and then is murdered by that trusted advisor, who then takes up the mask himself.
Mhm.
And then is later on himself killed, and the mask ends up back in the collection of Doc Ondar, the more cautious art collector on the Outer Rim. So we don't know who made the mask. We don't know how it was made, but I think this is one where maybe the soul has since departed and it might just be a Sith artifact.
Mhm.
But it is a receptacle for the memories of its previous users. And by selectively showing those memories, it seduces people to the dark side and then results in their death. So whether it's a trap produced by the Sith or there's still some ancient Sith memory or consciousness in the mask, it just felt relevant to compare to the other two.
This feels very much like a Horcrux. This feels most like a Harry Potter Horcrux, where it is a sliver of someone's consciousness and being transplanted into an object. Where I feel like the other masks, it held maybe the temporary persona, kind of like Jor-El, Superman's father in the Fortress of Solitude. He's a representation of whoever that person was at that point. Whereas a Horcrux is just something possessed by a poltergeist, by negative energy. That seems like a difference here in this mask. I think about the Sith and masks in general. I think that there's a kind of a proclivity in lore for the Sith to have some sort of mask, and that's because our most prominent Sith Lord, Darth Vader, wears a mask. I mean, the presence of that is undeniable. So whether we have someone like Darth Malgus who only has a respirator mask, or we have someone like Darth Revan who has his own significant kind of mask, a Sith Lord is usually associated with some sort of visage. Um, Not so much your
Well,
Darth Mauls and Tyrannus, but even Palpatine has a human mask in place of his more monstrous figure.
and I think it makes sense for Sith to be masked, especially during the period when they are hiding from the Jedi.
Mhm.
Uh, even Darth Sidious has his hood that he wears low over his face to hide his true identity.
Mhm.
Um, we see in the Acolyte there is a Sith who hides his face behind a mask, specifically to hide his identity,
Mhm.
so that he cannot be identified by the
And
Jedi.
yeah. And they're giving that some Catorsis lore as well, so it's lightsaber proof, and I guess Force mind reading proof as well.
Well, and that appears to be because it's blocking his eyes as well.
Mhm.
So yes, so Sith have a thing for masks in general, and Sith also have a thing for supporting the will of other people. So before we get into this next part, just a couple other mentions of where we see Sith soul binding take effect. There's a depiction in season 1 of Visions, um, the episode "The Old Master," where a Jedi master and his apprentice end up on a farming planet or a more rural planet, and they sense the presence of a powerful dark side user who looks like a kindly old man, but is really an ancient Sith from days long before, who has bound his own soul to his own body forcibly
Mhm.
and is looking to defeat a Jedi Master as his final act in life. And using the forbidden Trakata technique, the Jedi
Mhm.
Master is able to save his Padawan and himself by defeating the Sith Lord. And we literally see the Sith Lord's body crumble into mud and dirt after his death, in an inverse of how Yoda fades away into the Force to become a Force ghost. This Sith had bound his body to his soul to his body for so long that by the time he departed, his body crumbled and decayed. Centuries of decay apparently caught up all at once.
Mhm. Which is one of the coolest looking things that has ever happened, and very vampiric in a way, which, I mean, we even have uh, an unreleased draft of the episode 9 script where, in the hands of Colin Trevorrow, the director of Jurassic World and whatever sequels that came about, we have this idea of someone trying to teach Kylo Ren to pull the life force from living objects. Uh, Kind of continuing this idea of how does one maintain everlasting life. And that could have been a culmination, but developmentally we did not get it. Um, One other missing, kind of opportunity, we had Kylo Ren talking to Darth Vader's helmet, and to have any kind of Anakin Vader Force Ghost in the sequel trilogy could have been so interesting, so engaging, but it's something that just was not in the cards.
Yes, definitely places where we could have seen this utilized more, but we have to live with the Sith soul bindings that we have.
Hmm.
So the last example of sort of Sith soul binding that is present in current canon that I want to bring up is that of the Grand Inquisitor.
Sure.
So some spoilers for Rebels for those who haven't watched it, but at season 1 of Rebels conclusion, Kanan Jarrus defeats the Grand Inquisitor and he falls to his death.
Hmm.
We discover later that Palpatine and Vader bind the Grand Inquisitor's soul to a hidden Jedi repository, so that if anyone comes seeking the ancient Jedi secrets, the Grand Inquisitor's specter is there to kill them and drive them away. Luke eventually is able to defeat the Grand Inquisitor's soul during the period between A New Hope and Return of the Jedi, while he's seeking Jedi artifacts to enhance his training. Uh, but the Grand Inquisitor is still unable to leave and begs Vader to free him, and Vader refuses and rebinds his soul back to this location.
Hmm.
This is one of the first times we see the unwilling binding of a soul to a location where it is forced to be a guardian. And we know that the Grand Inquisitor was the servant of Palpatine and likely vulnerable to his machinations. But it's a sign, I think, of Palpatine's power that he's able to manipulate the Grand Inquisitor's soul in this way.
Hmm. And this is kind of scary. There's a little bit of, I don't know about body horror exactly, but this idea that some external force can bind your soul to something or someone is petrifying. So I always felt a little bit bad for the Grand Inquisitor because you can kind of tell that he was a dissatisfied Jedi Guardian. And he just, I mean, he's gone in the first season of Star Wars Rebels, and he does not get his chance to shine. And Kenobi doesn't do him any favors, and he's just very charismatic, almost lawful evil kind of character that I would like to see more of. So the fact that he is forced to remain as a ghost after not getting his fair shake in life is something that is horrifying and something that I could very much see Palpatine being responsible for.
Agreed. And I think Palpatine's I think it's a nice world building to show Palpatine's interest in soul binding,
Yeah.
in that he was seeking all of the ancient Sith secrets, trying to enter the world between worlds, trying to clone his own body, trying to keep an apprentice on deck that can help him do the dirty work. So
Hmm.
he's fully embracing himself as a Sith Lord in that
Yeah.
time.
Oh yeah.
And the Grand Inquisitor was one of Palpatine's backups if Vader didn't pan out.
Hmm. Yeah. Definitely understandable there. It's tough when you have the chosen one in your corner, even if he's missing most of his limbs.
So for our last subject, Connor, I think we want to mention some more Legends media that shows
Sure.
some of this Sith soul
Mhm.
manipulation. So what comes to your mind about this ancient forbidden Sith technique where either a person's binding their own soul or attempting to forcibly bind the souls of others? Specifically in a Sith context. We know that we have
Yeah.
the Dathomiri witches are able to do something
Hmm.
similar, trying to continue beyond the grave, but that is sort of a that's through the Dathomiri magic, which we'll talk about
Hmm.
another time.
Yeah, I thinking about it. I mean, we do see a sign of Darth Bane, who is a very popular Sith, one of my favorite Siths. He's primarily a legend Sith. He's the dark sider that decided, okay, there's only going to be a master and apprentice. We're done having a whole group of Sith. That is just a bad idea. And uh, from that point onward, we get that rule of two that ends with Palpatine and Vader. We do get one glimpse of him in canon in the Clone Wars episode where Yoda's going on this trial to see the wills. And it's left nebulous as to whether or not Yoda is searching for the light and dark within himself. He does face a dark side version of himself. But I'd like to think, just because I like Darth Bane, and I also quite enjoy the fact that Mark Hamill voices him, this concept that Darth Bane's echo, not so much his ghost, but just his imprint is left. I believe it's in his vaults, like in his grave, and is able to interact. But it's still that idea of not being an active living person. In fact, I think Yoda says as much. He's not connected to the living force. He's just kind of haunting the realm of reality. Uh, so it shows that this specter is very limited in comparison to a force ghost. Whether or not that is canon is kind of, again, it's dubious based on the canonicity of Clone Wars and whether or not that was an actual occurrence or just something that Yoda saw in his vision.
Yeah, Yoda was on a vision quest of some kind during that
Hmm.
arc in the Clone Wars, so it's uncertain whether this was the actual bound soul of Darth Bane, an echo of him, or just Yoda's own imagination of what kind of Sith would be guarding this vault here, and an
Hmm.
externalization of Yoda's own darkness he's struggling with.
Yeah.
Um, then one of the other just final points I want to point out in Legends is that Knights of the Old Republic had several examples of Sith who had bound themselves to places with moderate success. The most successful of which was the ghost of a Junta Pol, who had bound himself in his own tomb and tormented those who came and had tried to loot his tomb or acquire his objects. In fact, your two options in the game are to either destroy him utterly or turn an ancient Sith Lord back to the light side and help him find peace in the Force.
Hmm.
So, which I think is going against what we've seen in other media, where sort of the bound souls of Sith are sort of static and unable to change.
Yeah.
But that might just be because of the strength and charisma of your character in Knights of the Old Republic.
Hmm. It's interesting that we do get a hint at like Sith possession in the Knights of the Old Republic, but not a whimper of Force ghosts. Like it really shows that that's a later Force technique.
Yeah, so yeah, binding souls, ancient forbidden technique that the Sith have been perfecting for a long time, and other entities have even uh, attempted to mimic. There's the Ascendant, who are a dark side techno force fusion or force imitation society or secret cabal that the Sith fight against that attempt to code people's minds inside their own artifacts
Interesting.
technologically rather than using the Sith. We see this in Dr. Aphra. But again,
Hmm.
this is all dark side item. We never see any like the complete survival of someone's entire personality until
Hmm.
Qui-Gon Jinn and Yoda pull it off.
Yeah. And it's why we'll never get a poster that says Palpatine was right. Palpatine is objectively incorrect in all of his motivations and his morals. It's very clear that if anyone wanted to experience an afterlife, it would be the Jedi who aren't necessarily seeking their own personal continuation of life, but simply need to prolong their existence in order to benefit the next generation.
Well, I think that is all that I had to say about Sith soul binding as far as examples. And I think just the last thing to say on the subject is, in comparison to the force powers we see Jedi using, we can definitely see that this is a darker power, binding souls and or someone's personality after their death, attempting to achieve some kind of twisted immortality, Voldemort style. So it's definitely the dark mirror to the Force Ghost, which is a wise counselor. This is someone
Mhm.
trying to exist beyond their time and take over the lives of others and use them as vessels.
Exactly. So maybe down the line we'll get into if they ever decide to expand on the droid lore a little bit and kind of get into some of the afterlife of a droid, we can get into that realm or other extraterrestrial realms. But at this point, I think this is a full study of what we have as far as the Sith go. Just a nasty, unnatural way of continuing life.
All right. Well, thank you for discussing the Sith soul binding technique, Connor, and as well as their stylish, terrifying masks. Join us next week, listeners, for more Star Wars.
Until then, we'll see you sometime soon in a galaxy right here.